It's my privilege to welcome you to Osgoode Hall Law School if it's your first time visiting Osgoode, and to welcome you to the faculty common room, which is what this room is. This is where the faculty get together for our meetings and to hear about ideas and presentations from scholars. And it's a room that we use for functions when we expect a lot of people and we want people to be able to be free to move around. And so what we have today for you is an event to detail a very sad story, but a very important story that offers lessons about criminal justice, punishment, and the ways in which our criminal justice system goes about performing its function. We're going to watch first a video, and then we're going to hear from one of the central players in that story, Yusuf Faqiri, who is the brother of the individual that we're here really to think about and to learn about, Soli Faqiri, who was Yusuf's brother and who died while in custody at the hands of the institution that was supposed to be protecting him and providing him with his basic needs. And so we'll hear more about that story of injustice in the criminal justice system, both through the video and from Yusuf, and there'll be an opportunity for anybody who's interested to offer comments or, more importantly, ask questions to Yusuf, who's agreed to spend some time with us after he speaks. And then we'll probably break with a bit of time for more informal mingling and discussion. So those of you that wish to speak more with Yusuf or with each other about what you've seen and heard, I hope the space will provide room for you to do that. If you haven't had a chance to grab some lunch, there's pizza, cheese pizza, vegetarian pizza, and halal pepperoni pizza. So please, I don't mind if you walk across the room while I'm still standing here, but I hope we won't have too much traffic when the video is playing or later. So please make your move now if you'd like to grab something to eat. There's plenty left. I want to thank the Nathanson Center on Transnational Crime, Human Rights and National Security, which is the principal sponsor of the event. They paid for the pizza and they've supported us in many ways. Unfortunately, the co-directors, Professors Heidi Matthews and Francois Tanguay-Renaud, are not able to be here today, but they both offered their words of support, and welcome to all of you. We also have, I believe, 3 student clubs that have offered resources, time, energy, labor, moving chairs, organizing, promoting, and those are the Osgoode Hall Muslim Law Students Association, the Mental Health Law Association, and the Criminal Law Association. I hope I've gotten those 3 student club sponsors right, and we thank you very much for your interest and for your dedication to the cause of this story. And I just want to also let everybody know that this event is being filmed and recorded. Any questions that you ask or anything that you say needs to be said into this microphone, not because it's doing anything to help amplify your voice, but just because it's recording, and it'll go into a video that's going to be posted online and will be available for everybody to see. So if you have friends or family that aren't here and that you think should have been here, I hope you will we'll be sure to provide that link when it's available, and I hope that you'll encourage other people to have a look at that and to learn more about the story. So you're being recorded, you're being filmed, you're being photographed. We have journalists in the house from a number, at least 2 major Toronto publications, the Excalibur and the Toronto Star. I think that's all you need to know. Oh, washrooms are out the door to the right and then down the hall to the left. Men's and women's washrooms are that way if you need to find them. So first we're going to put the video on. We'll dim the lights, and the video runs about 20 minutes. And then I will invite Yusuf Faqiri up to the podium. I'm not going to provide him with any introduction. He's going to tell us who he is and what his connection to this story is. So without further ado, let's get the video queued up.
I come to all of you with greetings of peace with humility, with hope, and compassion, to wanting to make a sincere difference to the lives of the voiceless. But before I start, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank the Muslim Students Association, the Law School Students Association, the Nathanson Center, Professor Faisal Baba, to bringing me here today. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this happened in our country. Yes, this happened in our province. Yes, this happened an hour and a half from here in Lindsay, Ontario. Yes, a man who was mentally ill, who needed compassion, who needed help, mercilessly and violently loses his life in the very institution that's supposed to protect him. Before I start this presentation, I have a sincere and a hopeful request of all of you. I'm honored to speak in front of all of you this afternoon, and that each and every single one of you down the road are going to be practitioners in the legal field, whether it will be paramedics, law enforcement. Know that people with mental illness, their lives are not cheap. They have a story to tell, and their story should be told through a lens of compassion, through a lens of respect, dignity, and honor that my late brother did not get. Just know that you have that goal. Just know that when you cross someone's path with mental illness, that you have that obligation, that duty, because people with mental illness do not choose to have these illnesses. It's given to them. So remember, as future lawyers, paramedics, law enforcement, that will cross the path of people with mental illness, don't forget these words, ladies and gentlemen. This is words of a broken man, of a man who's only fighting for a beautiful soul that was taken mercilessly. And as we know, as we've seen, Suleiman's story isn't the only story that we should talk about. I'm here today to speak about Suleiman, but for the many others. This is a pandemic. And so, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm hoping to do in my presentation before we get to Q&A is talk about Suleiman's life, who he was, what he meant for my family. That'll be the first part of the presentation. The second part will be the violent end to his life. We saw part of it here in this piece, but I wanted to fill in the gaps, because 20 minutes does not do justice to what happened to my beautiful, amazing late brother. And then the final part is the Justice for Soli movement of what is doing today. And some members of our team is here this afternoon. So I start the presentation with two very simple questions, ladies and gentlemen. And the first question will be, if I can get a show of hands of how many individuals in this room have a family member or someone close to them that's suffering from mental illness? How many people believe that people with mental illness should be in segregation? That's what I thought. So we all have a stake in this case, ladies and gentlemen. We all have a role to play. So let's talk about Suleiman's life. He was born the second of 5 kids. We came here as refugees from Afghanistan in the early 1990s. And life's trajectory. And ladies and gentlemen, every single presentation I do, it's usually this part that's the hardest, because it's this human part, right? I was very close to my brother. I loved him dearly. So please bear with me. And this is the most difficult part. So it's hard to talk about him. He was born the second of 5 kids. I was the oldest. Came here in Canada in the early 1990s. Grew up in a city called Pickering, Ontario, which is about 30 minutes east of Toronto. Suleiman in high school, just like throughout his life, was a man that was quite talented. And evidently, as you can notice, being the oldest brother, there was a jealousy, ladies and gentlemen. He's better than me in Donkey Kong, Super Nintendo, it was kind of annoying, actually. And even when we played soccer in our, when you were 12, 13, he was the best player, even though I'm the oldest brother. So I took that, personally, as you can appreciate. But academically as well, ladies and gentlemen, I remember in high school, He was superior to me and just incredibly talented. So in high school, he was a straight A student in all the science subjects, whether it was math, algebra, calculus, in addition to the fact that he was simultaneously playing football and rugby at the same time. This is who Suleiman was. But this was part of him. The thing that has the most important legacy, which always makes it difficult for me to talk about, is his relationship with his family. And this is the one part that he never allowed for his illness to take away from him. His illness took a lot from him, but his closeness to his family was incredible. I remember when he was in high school, he would always throw it in my face, joke around half-heartedly, but saying, I'm mom's favorite son. I'm like, well, I'm the oldest. But, in the end, we found out that he was mom's favorite son. So he was very close to all of my family members. I want to share this personal aspect, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't want the mental illness just to be about Suleiman. We have to talk about the human aspect here. That's very important for all of us. So in high school, he ended up playing football, rugby, and also a straight A student. Then ended up getting enrolled at the University of Waterloo's environmental engineering program. If anybody knows anything about University of Waterloo, we know that it's one of the most competitive schools when it comes to engineering. And so his life's trajectory was that. But then everything would change in the spring of 2005 during his first year in his second semester. And when he got into a car accident, it was shortly after this car accident that Suleiman was diagnosed with this illness that we know as schizophrenia, this severe mental illness known as schizophrenia. And although his life's trajectory would forever take a sharp turn and change, Suleiman, the man, the character, the human being, the soul, would remain steadfast. His legacy stands here today, catapulted and firm in that he was a man that inspired every single member of my family. Personal story I say to people is that he, after his illness, he ended up, and although he didn't finish his studies at Waterloo, he ended up picking up the third language. So his native tongue was Farsi and then English, who he spoke fluently, and then he ended up picking Arabic. And for some of the members of the audience that know, Arabic is the language that's in our holy book, the Quran. And so he actually was fluent, and he actually taught my mom. He taught my mom how to read the Quran. He was her teacher. He taught my youngest brother. This is after his illness. He was able to pick up this language. So when we talk about somebody who's having mental illness, ladies and gentlemen, don't think that intellectually they're inferior to anybody. Don't think that intellectually they're hindered. They're not. And Suleiman taught us that. So he was my mom's teacher. For my youngest brother, he taught him how to drive. And for me, as I was getting closer to my faith, and this is his personal legacy towards me, is he taught me how to pray. I stand here today telling you this, ladies and gentlemen. And, he was loved incredibly by my nephews and nieces. And that was his legacy. And if we're to describe and to summarize who Suleiman was, I could speak all day, but there's a few words. He's a man that was known for his generosity, his love, his faith, and his devotion to his family and his intellectual capacity. That's who Suleiman was. And if you would like to know more about him, you could go to our website, justiceforsoli.com, and on some of our social media, which we'll talk about shortly. But that's who Suleiman was. So that is the case. That is Suleiman's life, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about his death. Let's talk about the circumstances of his death. We have some context here, but I want to fill in certain aspects here. December 4th, 2016, he's temporarily taken into custody at the Central East Correctional Center. The more appropriate term, ladies and gentlemen, that we need to use, and journalists often use this, which is appropriate, is the Lindsay Super Jail. The Lindsay Super Jail, which has been used by journalists. So this jail, according to the Ontario Ombudsman, which is the organ of government that oversees complaints. So the Ombudsman oversees complaints of provincial jails. And according to the Ontario Ombudsman, for the year of 2015 and 2016, this was the most complained jail. Just a year before Suleiman's death, in the summer of 2015, there was another man by the name of Somali Canadian by the name of Abdurrahman Hassan, who also lost his life, who also was suffering from bipolar disorder. To give you context. So, temporarily taken into custody on December 4th, to never be seen to us again until December 15th. Let's talk about these intervening 11 days, ladies and gentlemen. My family drove physically to Lindsay 4 times. My mom and dad 3 times, myself once, with my younger brother. Not once did they allow my family to see Suleiman. And the one time that I went to see Suleiman with my younger brother, Sorab, I went and I waited for staff. I articulated to them that Suleiman was suffering from mental illness. This is in addition to the fact, ladies and gentlemen, that at this time he was 30. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was 19. So this is 11 years in the making. It's well documented. It's not as if this came out of the blue. And the most important part of this, ladies and gentlemen, for anyone that knows someone with mental illness, the difference between someone who can have a decent life and survive with mental illness is family support. They took that away from Suleiman. They took that away from him, not for him to see his mother. And to this day, ladies and gentlemen, we have not been told why. And as Canadians, as Ontarians, as human beings, this is absolutely appalling and unacceptable. They took his dignity and his support away from him. A very proactive family that wasn't able to see him. And to this day, we have not been told why. And we have to be alarmed. We have to truly be alarmed, ladies and gentlemen. This is an institution that operates on our taxpayers. They are to report to us. They're accountable to us. They have to be transparent to us. So, weren't able to see him, and we have not been told almost 3 years later why. A couple days before his death, an Ontario judge ordered Suleiman to be transferred to a mental health facility. This was 3 days before his death, I believe. And he was supposed to be transferred. And the only reason he was not transferred, ladies and gentlemen, is because he was waiting for a bed. Instead, he loses his life 3 days later. It's one of the biggest tragedies of this case, among many things, is that arrangements were made. The judiciary ordered him to be transferred, but he wasn't. Instead of spending his time through compassion and care, he's given to my family in a body bag. Took my mom 11 years through her unwavering love to keep Suleiman alive. Yet it took the justice system 11 days for them to be killed under government care. It took my mom 11 years to keep Suleiman alive through her unwavering love. A very simple yet very courageous woman, my mother. Yet it took the justice system 11 days for him to be killed under their care. Ladies and gentlemen, I come from a community, within the Muslim community, the Afghan community, a lot of us struggle with the embracing of mental illness. But it was my mom's leadership and courage. I share this personal story to all of you that literally my mom took us to her leadership to accepting and embracing Suleiman for who he was. You know, the broader Muslim community, we struggle with this. And broader society, we struggled with this. And, you know, I share this statement to you. 11 years, ladies and gentlemen, she kept him alive. Through her compassion, her love, her care. Yet it took 11 days for the justice system to kill him under government care. 11 years, 11 days. 11 years, a week and a half. That's it. Let's think about that, all of us, when we're thinking about people suffering from mental illness. This is our system, ladies and gentlemen. So after Suleiman's death, there was essentially a few investigations. I'll talk about the coroner's investigation and the police investigation, and later on, perhaps in Q&A or later on in the presentation, I'll talk about the ministry's investigation. So let's talk about the very climactic day of December 15th, Suleiman's last day on this earth. So after Suleiman's death, two investigations effectively took place. Well, let's talk about the police investigation. So actually, let's talk about the coroner's investigation first. So the coroner did their investigation, a very fulsome investigation. It took about 8 months in their investigation. And here's the facts that we have, ladies and gentlemen, is that on December 15th, at the time of Suleiman's death, both his legs and his hands were tied. His pepper sprayed twice. He had a spit hood. And multiple guards, upwards of almost a dozen, were taking turns beating him. And the coroner said there was 50 bruises on his body. The coroner deemed it a significant number of these bruises were termed medically blunt impact trauma. 50 bruises, ladies and gentlemen, every single one inflicted by the guards. Legs and hands are tied, pepper sprayed twice. Often, sometimes I hear in discussion that this was an altercation. I don't know who would ever call this an altercation. A man who's defenseless, who literally cannot defend himself, has 50 bruises on his body. Those were the last few minutes of Suleiman's life. I'll ask you a question is, what possesses anybody to apply force to a mentally ill man? You know, you saw this video. At the beginning, I can't watch because his body's laying down. And when we were washing his body, in which I fainted, I couldn't stay throughout it, there was a huge gash on his forehead. Marks everywhere on his body and his torso. This was my brother. And the reason we're speaking here today, ladies and gentlemen, isn't just about Suleiman. The reason I'm opening my heart and looking anguished in front of you is because I want to make sure that there isn't another Suleiman. I want to make sure that another family does not go through the anguish and the pain. This is very hard for me. It's taken a lot from me. But I'm doing this so we do not have another family going through what this family is going through. Because we must do better. We have to do better. It's between life and death. So that's the coroner's investigation. Let's look at the police investigation now. So the police took about a year. The local police investigating the local jail. The Kawartha Lakes Police Service, which has jurisdiction in the area that we know Kawartha Lakes, that includes the township of Lindsay, Ontario. They decided to do, they had carriage over the case, and they did a 1-year-long investigation. And in that 1-year-long investigation, they sent an email to our lawyer, Nader Hassan. An email, ladies and gentlemen. There are no grounds for charges. There are no grounds for charges. What does that say? That effectively says that that's okay. No grounds for charges. It's not like Suleiman just rolled over and died. We see the evidence with the 50 bruises. But there's something else that's very important, ladies and gentlemen. We saw in this video the eyewitness that spoke about seeing everything. So I asked the question to the Kawartha Lakes Police Services, how do you close the case without truly speaking to the eyewitness? That's a very important question. How do you close the case without speaking to the eyewitness? We've already lost Suleiman. What other more agony does my mother need to go through? When she often asks me, Yusuf, when am I going to get accountability for my son? I say, Mom, you got to wait. I buried my child, Yusuf. My pain pales comparison to the pain of my mother or my father. But how do you close the investigation, ladies and gentlemen, without speaking to the eyewitness? Absolutely unacceptable. And we as Canadians, as Ontarians, we have to be disturbed. We have to be alarmed. We have to be appalled. But thankfully, After the eyewitness came forward, thankfully the Office of the Chief Coroner called for a new investigation to be led by the Ontario Provincial Police, and that's where the case is at today. It's being led by the Ontario Provincial Police. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, it's an important start, but we're asking for the same thing as we did since December 15th. We want answers, we want accountability for what happened to Suleiman. And I'll tell you what accountability, answers, and transparency looks like when I talk about the movement. Before I get to the movement, I want to share one last investigation. And in Q&A, we can talk about details in terms of some of the stuff with what we already discussed. The Ministry of Community Safety Correctional Services, which is now the Ministry of the Solicitor General, did their own internal ministry investigation. And their investigation bore some fruit. What fruit did it bear? The guards that were involved in Suleiman's death were fired, and some were suspended. This is very different from a criminal perspective. They were just fired, and some of them were suspended. So I asked the question, begs a very fundamental question, is the guards are fired from the ministry's investigation. Why did the Court of Lakes Police Service did not deem criminal charges? So that's the ministry's investigation. So let's talk about the Justice for Soli movement. And before I talk about the movement, if I can get everybody to pull up your phones, ladies and gentlemen. I know you didn't expect that. I'm not a social media person either, ladies and gentlemen. It started around you guys' age. So if everybody could pull up your phones, I'll make sure I wait. I know I'm being that person. Okay. If I get everybody in the room, if you can go to our social media, Justice for Soli, on Facebook, or on Twitter, or on Instagram. If I said anything, ladies and gentlemen, that invokes anything, please say it on Twitter. If you go to our Facebook page and follow us, I'm not seeing any phones move. So Justice for Soli. Push the computer. So. So after Suleiman passed away, after he was killed, a couple of days after his death, I had a very important conversation with my mom, and as a family, we decided to speak out. And although this was painful, this was a very painful decision by my family, but we felt a need to speak out. And so what we did as a family, after this conversation, with a couple of friends, we started the Justice for Soli campaign. And the campaign has two mandates, ladies and gentlemen. And the first mandate of the campaign is we want accountability for the guards who killed Suleiman for criminal charges to be pressed. Very simple, very direct. That's accountability, that's what it looks like. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, because this movement isn't just about Suleiman, it's a much more wider epidemic issue that we have that we have a duty to solve. And the second part of this mandate of this campaign is to achieve accountability and transparency for Suleiman will enable us to make sure another family does not go through what my family is going through. We speak for the voiceless, ladies and gentlemen. We speak for individuals that are suffering in silence. We're here for them. So we started this movement. And it's incredible, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to share this personal story with all of you. It's incredible when your conviction is through sincerity and a humble perspective, how much work you can get done. It was myself and a few students and some of my friends that started this movement. And where we are today, compared to 3 years ago, we say in Arabic, we say, Alhamdulillah. It's an humbling honor that where we've been able to achieve what the movement has achieved. And this is all through a sincere hope of wanting to make a difference, through a compassionate perspective of wanting to make a difference. So let me talk about some of this stuff, ladies and gentlemen. So our movement throughout the last few years, we've had multiple vigils, one in February 2017, one on December 2017, one on December 2018. And if anybody's interested, please attend on vigil on December 2018. Professor Faisal will be speaking as well. Haider Saeed will be speaking as well. We'll have multiple speakers. Desmond Cole will be there. This will be the 3-year anniversary of Suleiman's death at Dundas Square. Our campaign head, Maymouna, is here too, or one of our blog leads. Our blog lead, Michelle's here. Haider's here. A few of our team is here today. So if anybody has questions about the movement, our vigil, we'll be having vigils in Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, and Winnipeg. Across the nation, ladies and gentlemen. Because mental illness does not discriminate. It affects males, females, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic backgrounds, coast to coast, rural to rural, town to town, city to city. It touches all of us, ladies and gentlemen. And the fact that we're having vigils across the nation on December 15th about Suleiman's story talks about the wider issue. So we'd be honored if anybody's interested in coming to our vigil. And we can talk more details during Q&A. And we have flyers for the vigil. Dundas Square, December 15th at 6 p.m. We have a social media following on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This is a medium that I'm not very familiar with, but started a few years after me. So it's supposed to be funny. But anyways, we have following about 3,000 on each platform. Please follow us to get, we do daily posts in terms of what's going on with the case and also our movement and other families. We'll be launching a family coalition, ladies and gentlemen, in January 2020, which involves families across the nation that have lost their loved ones with mental illness in provincial or federal jails. The details for that event has not been finalized, but it will be led by our movement. It's either going to be January 2020 or February 2020. It's going to be either launched in Toronto or Ottawa, Ontario. We'll be calling a press conference there. That's the national tour. In addition to that, ladies and gentlemen, earlier this year we launched our national tour, where we've spoken in Vancouver, Montreal, Victoria, Winnipeg, Thunder Bay, Ottawa, Kingston, London, Waterloo, Halifax, and several other cities. I mentioned these cities purposely, ladies and gentlemen, because every single city I went, there's a tragic story there. Right? What does that say? It says that we have a problem. This is a national conversation. This is not an Ontario issue. This is not a Toronto issue. This is a national conversation. And so I went and spoke and met different families, and I was invited by different groups of folks, different groups of people from different perspectives. And it was generally the same thing that came out is, this shouldn't have happened. Why did this happen? There was no transparency, no accountability. And it's our job to change that. It's our obligation. So that was the national tour. Just about early last month, we launched our law school tour. And we're very honored to speak at Osgood this afternoon. This is the first of our law schools in Toronto. We've already spoken at Dalhousie, McGill, University of Windsor, University of Manitoba, and then Osgood, and then one at U of T in January, and then University of Saskatchewan, University of Alberta, spring 2020. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, this is particularly important for me to speak with you folks because you have an extra layer of responsibility, right? Perhaps some of you might be, legal aid or individuals that work as duty counsel in courts, right? Perhaps you've had your discussions already. You'll be running into people that are suffering from mental illness. You might be their last hope, literally, between life and death. So remember that. Remember that, very important, ladies and gentlemen. We have bi-weekly blogs. Michelle, who runs our blogs, we write different stories on different families, different areas of mental illness, whether it's homelessness, whether it's hospitals, different sectors. So if anybody has an idea or interested in telling your own personal story, please speak with Michelle. We have our bi-weekly blogs that's put on LinkedIn and then comes to our social media. So, and we have an editor that works into this. So that's one area. This movement, ladies and gentlemen, isn't about Yusuf Faqiri or Suleiman Faqiri or the Faqiri family. This movement is a bunch of Canadians coming together that believe that mental illness and how people are treated within the justice system needs to change. That's what the Justice for Soli movement is about, ladies and gentlemen. So that's another part of our movement. We have a petition that's been signed by 17,000 people across the nation. It's on change.org. So if you're interested, please sign our petition. We have we've spoken in front of the Ontario Human Rights Commissioner, who's done an incredible job on talking about the intersectionality of mental illness and incarceration. We have a research paper that was published in 2018 that looked at the intersectionality of mental illness and incarceration. We have copies of that, so if anybody's interested, we'll love to give you a copy. Michelle worked on that. We have 2 research papers coming up end of next month. One looks at 10 cases in Canada of individuals that have had mental illness that have died, whether it's provincially or federally. They look across different cleavages and compare it to Suleiman's case. That research paper is being done by my research team 1. That's coming out in December. The other research paper, Haider is one of the leads on research paper 2. It looks at, it's a comparison between the Christina John settlement and Suleiman, my brother's case, and that looks at specifically about Christina John was a young woman who had schizophrenia, who was put in segregation. The Ontario government had a settlement with her saying that we will not put people in segregation that are suffering with mental illness. Well, guess what? Suleiman in those 11 days was put in segregation. So there's a comparison. That's research paper 2. That'll be published next month as well. Haider is one of the leads on the paper. So there's 2 research papers. Maimouna, did I forget anything in terms of some of the other work? Okay, there's a documentary that is about Suleiman that's done by his friends. It's about 30 minutes. We're going to launch that next month. There's a PBS article that will be coming, PBS video interview out of the United States will come out that we've been interviewed. That's coming out. That's some of the work, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of how you can help is a couple of things. One, we're still trying to raise funds for a campaign, not for a campaign, for legal costs. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, we lost Suleiman, but we have to build a price. We have to take care of this. So we're still trying to raise funds for the legal costs of the campaign. So that's one way to help us. Another way to help us, ladies and gentlemen, is follow us on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We can give you the handles, but it's pretty easy to find on social media. If I can find it, you can find it. That's another way to help us. Another way to help us is our petition, to sign our petition. Another way to help us, ladies and gentlemen, is we're still looking volunteer. We're a team of 15 individuals. We're looking for volunteers, 2 to 3 hours a week. Our meetings are mobile. It's an incredibly special team, the individuals that are working on this team. I just get the honor to speak. I'm just humbled with the immense talent that people in this movement have. So we have different streams if anybody's interested. We have an outreach team. We have a social media team. We have 2 research teams. We'll be having our fundraising dinner next, I think it'll be January 2020. So if anybody's interested, we have different teams. And our campaign head, Maimouna Mohammed, is here too. And Haider is here, and Michelle and John are all here if you have any questions about the campaign. That's some of the work that the movement is doing, and then please come to our vigil. And so before I start with Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to say 2 things, 3 things actually. One, there was an incident at UFT. I don't know if anybody read the article, a young woman. I was actually, a couple days before that incident, I was in the Bayan building at a meeting there, and I was there at that moment where a young woman lost her life. Literally, I was at that time, and we had to escort the building. This was the student at UFT. And then I read this article this morning. A friend of mine sent me this article about this young woman from UFT who went to the police officers there and saying that I have a crisis. And they said, our protocol is to arrest you. Our protocol is to arrest you. Your protocol is to arrest this woman who's in a mental health distress, and they didn't even allow her to have Her friend accompanied her in the car because she had suicidal thoughts. This is your protocol? I'm sorry, that's not absolutely unacceptable. When you're a stressed student dealing with mental health issues, the last thing you need is to be at the whims of a protocol. So please read the story. There's a publication ban on the identity of the person, but there's a CBC and the Star both wrote about this story. It's absolutely unacceptable. Protocol. So I want to share that story because I know mental illness is slowly affecting more individuals that are studying. The services need to change. We need to give more services within the different university sectors. So I wanted to share that with you. Please read that story. And usually I end my presentations with two things. The first part is Edward Snowshoe's life mattered. Cass Geddes' life mattered. Pierre Corleone's life mattered. Justin Saint-Amour's life mattered. Moses Beaver's life mattered. Abdurrahman Hassan's life mattered. Errol Green's life mattered. Laura Strong's life mattered. And Suleiman Faqiri's life mattered. Every single name I mentioned was individuals that lost their lives in the justice system, both federally or provincially, who suffer from mental illness, come from different walks of life. Some First Nations, some from different communities. Every single one did not get the one thing they deserve, and that was compassion. And they lost their life. Their family continues to suffer. We as Canadians deserve better. We as Ontarians deserve better. We as human beings deserve better, ladies and gentlemen. And I want you to think about this quote before you start the Q&A. The greatest measure of a society is how that society treats its most vulnerable. The greatest measure of a society is how that society treats its most vulnerable. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, I want to thank Yusuf. Don't go too far. Maybe just get some pizza.
Coffee.
There was supposed to have been a second speaker today who was going to offer remarks, some additional context. That's from the perspective of a prison lawyer. Unfortunately, for reasons for which I am entirely to blame, not her, that lawyer, Nancy Charbonneau, is unable to be here. But she nonetheless forwarded me some comments that I'd actually like to share with you all. And I'll invite Yusuf to maybe respond if he has any responses, and then we'll move on to hear from the room. And that's because she touches on some things that Yusuf just mentioned. So Nancy's career as a prison lawyer means she represents prisoners inside the prison system, primarily at the federal level. And what she said is that she's been aware for a long time that correctional officers in Ontario routinely assault inmates as a group and provide cover for each other. This is a systemic problem. They also turn a blind eye to inmate assaults far too often. That's inmate assaults on each other. She says this is not the case in federal corrections, where assaults by correctional officers are not tolerated. She said for many years, staff who were not comfortable with the abuse used by correctional officers in the jails were themselves bullied for whistleblowing, for bringing it to light, which reinforced the culture of violence and the abuse of power. In 2013, the Ministry of Community Safety and Correctional Services entered into minutes of settlement as part of a Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario settlement agreement that Yusuf referred to. That's known as the John Settlement, 2013. And this was after an individual by the name of John was killed or died in custody. And the point of that settlement was to address these systemic issues. Those terms included the development of mental health screening tools and follow-up assessment by a physician if necessary. This is within the jail. Improvement in access to mental health services for incarcerated inmates. Reforms to policies and practice regarding the placement and management of inmates in, quote, administrative and, quote, disciplinary segregation, as well as improved mental health training for frontline staff and managers within the ministry. All of these were identified as necessary steps to be taken in 2013. So by 2017, the ministry claimed that it had, quote, substantially complied with the John public interest remedies. The ministry took the position that it was in compliance. John was implemented, and that these are, quote, complex issues that are not amenable to a quick resolution. But yet the ministry claimed that it had achieved that. In January of 2018, however, there was an independent review that was conducted. And that independent reviewer was called upon by Cabinet to report on the implementation of that John settlement. And the reviewer was Justice David Cole, who found, quote, that there are a number of unaddressed or inadequately addressed issues that continue to be troubling in relation to the placement and maintenance of mentally ill prisoners in what are now termed conditions that resemble segregation. So the ministry was able to claim for some time that it had done away with segregation, but what became clear was that it was simply segregation called something else. And additional substantial training for the staff specific to mental health first aid was not being provided. De-escalation techniques, the accommodation of human rights were all problems that were identified in 2019, 6 years after the John settlement. And so according to Nancy Charbonneau, based on this information, she says there was no excuse for officers in 2017 not having better training to manage Suleiman and whatever symptoms he presented with. Presumably, this will come out in the further investigation. And so maybe if I could just turn it back to you, Yusuf, to comment a little bit on that and the fact that I heard you identify 3 separate investigations that have now been completed, and you're now engaged in the 4th investigation. What more or what different do you hope to achieve through this investigation?
Yeah, I think the most important part in this investigation, it's the same thing since day one, is accountability. My brother didn't roll over and die. We need criminal charges pressed against the guards who took Suleiman's life. This is and to say it in a direct term, justice. That's what justice looks for us, right? Accountability and criminal charges. This shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't be talking about this almost 3 years later, right? But and the fact that we got a second police investigation itself, this is something we need, it's important, and we're thankful that it happened, but, the evidence of what happened to Suleiman is compelling. And with respect to your comment with the Christina John settlement, Professor Faisal, is that that was 3 years before Suleiman's death. And we have to ask ourselves the very fundamental question is, why was Suleiman put in segregation still? And the simple answer to that is, there's this idea that accountability doesn't exist within the system. And that's not acceptable. I'll give everybody else another example. There's a very important case that we should all read, and a lot of legal academics and practitioners have studied this case, is by the name of a First Nations man by the name of Adam Capay. The Human Rights Commissioner was going through the Thunder Bay jail. I was just going by, was visiting the jail, and it came out, that there was this fella was in segregation for 2,000 days. This was after 2013. Provincial jail, this was in Thunder Bay. First Nations man. Why is he in segregation? Right? Suleiman was 2016. Then the 2 names that I just mentioned to you, Justin Saint-Amour and Cass Geddes. One died 8 days before Suleiman. Cass died 2 months after. Both in the Ottawa Carleton Detention Center. Both were on suicide watch. Both had schizophrenia. Both were in segregation. 2016, 2017. This settlement is 2013. Why is it still happening? The simple answer, ladies and gentlemen, is the accountability is very rare. It doesn't exist. I mean, it's one thing, and Professor Faisal can talk about this, to put it into policy. But where's the practicality of it? Right?
Okay, great. Well, with that, why don't we open up the floor? We've got at least 15 or 20 minutes for any questions, comments, requests for further information. Anybody?
There's one right there. Oh.
Whoever can go first.
You were the first person I saw. So
Okay, sure.
you're the easiest to reach.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
So firstly, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming here and for sharing your story. I know how difficult that must be, especially after experiencing a traumatic situation. And I want to express my condolences for your loss. And, you know, what you're talking about and the struggle is very real. And affects a lot of people. So there are a couple things that kind of came to mind as a law student when I was hearing your story. The first was the failure of both his defense lawyer and the judge in terms of not deeming him or not giving him the defense of NCRMD. So I was wondering, and I have a few comments after that, but to begin with, so that he got sent to a forensic psych facility as opposed to like a normal jail. So do you know like what happened with that? And I really, like, as future lawyers in the room, I really want to point that out as like, for anybody who is interested in being a defense lawyer, the importance of that and how this came about due to the failure of lawyers and the judge as well.
Absolutely. You know, I will say this, the judge who ordered Suleiman to be transferred, he was probably the only person in those 11 days that actually did help my family. The judge did, after a testimony that we made, the judge effectively heard us loud and clear and ordered him to be transferred to a mental health facility. The facility was the one that was mum. The facility was the one that never, to this day, hasn't given us any information. And with respect to a defense lawyer, at that time, we got defense lawyer after Suleiman's passing, and an incredibly competent and probably one of the most gifted lawyers in the country might be Nader Hassan. But the problem with all this, with all due respect, is that you have a proactive family, but the system still kind of pushes you away. You know what I mean? Like, we made arrangements, like the judge heard Suleiman loud and clear what happened and ordered me to be transferred. So why didn't the institution transfer him?
But like even before that, when he was first in custody, I see that. What you're saying is he didn't have a trial within. Well,
this is very important.
Waiting for his trial.
So if we paid attention, this is very important, ladies and gentlemen. An important distinction we make. Suleiman was temporarily in custody. He was never ever convicted of anything. This is very important. He was supposed to be, and that's why when my lawyers speak, when Nader speaks, it makes it very clear that he was temporarily in custody. The police that originally took him shouldn't have taken him to the jail. They should have taken him to the hospital. So he was never an inmate from the traditional sense. This is what makes Suleiman's story even more tragic, ladies and gentlemen, is that he was never in custody. He was supposed to be temporarily housed. And the judge did their due diligence by ordering him to be transferred. But the guards took turns beating him to death. I say these terms, ladies and gentlemen, in this aggressive way for us to really understand, what happened to this man. And also, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not trying to scare anybody. This could happen to anybody. This could happen to any of us.
Yeah, so he didn't even have a trial.
No.
He hadn't had a trial yet. Yeah,
So because he was supposed to get help, right?
Yeah, and I also think bringing to light the issue of the lack of beds is incredibly important, and how that also, the lack of beds and in the forensic psychiatric facility really also was another system failure that occurred.
I think that's what's your name, by the way?
Samara.
Another important comment to your comment, Samara, is that with respect to beds, this is another issue, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is literally only one institution, if I'm correct, in Brockville, Ontario, that's a permanent facility with individuals that went through the justice system that are suffering with mental illness. That's the only facility in the entire province that has a bunch of beds, and that's it. So now we also have, Samara brought another point of what's the role of the health departments, right? The jails have now become effectively the new hospitals, right? So there's multiple intersectionalities, right?
Yeah.
So the bed, he's waiting for a bed. Now imagine how many other individuals were waiting for the bed, right? Justin Saint-Amour, this fella, his mom will be speaking at the vigil, Laureen, in Toronto. The guard walked 3 times as this fellow was getting ready to kill himself. He saw him put the sheet, then he went for the second round, then he went for the third round. The guard never got charged in the inquest. Think about that. There's a hand right here. Someone had a question here too, right? Don't be shy, ladies and gentlemen. Please ask whatever you feel like to ask. Go ahead.
I just wanted to echo my colleague's sentiments. Thank you so much for sharing such an intimate but important story and message. And again, condolences for you and your family's loss. I guess my question is sort of what your brother's case and what many other similar cases show is this tension, or I guess to put it bluntly, maybe the criminal justice system doesn't have any business in sort of dealing with issues related or incidents involving mental health. So my question is, what sort of alternatives would you like to see?
I think it's a brilliant question. I think this is the kind of compassion that we're seeking. Is the criminal justice system does no business to see people with mental illness, because practitioners, nurses, psychiatric nurses, psychiatrists, doctors should be the frontline folks, or paramedics, right, that deal with people with mental illness, right, understanding their difficulties, right, and you know, I dream of a society, and I mean this in a metaphoric, poetic, but also in a pragmatic perspective, is that I dream of a society where people with mental illness, enough money is spent for them to be in a hospital where they're able to cultivate, to blossom into the beautiful individuals they can be. And that's possible, ladies and gentlemen. We spend so millions of dollars on education. Why can't we spend billions of dollars on people with mental health? We talk about climate change, which is an important thing in our society, but mental illness, when does it ever come in our psyche? You know, and I know it's changed over time, but we have to think about this in our elections and stuff. We need to really make this shift, right? Only until you lose someone near and dear to you do you realize, and I'm sorry to use this word, how decayed the system is, right? We as a country have accomplished many wonderful things, but we're behind when it comes to mental illness. United Kingdom is an example to follow through. Even the United States, in my opinion, has its system, you know, there is much more of a proactive part compared to Canada. So I think to answer your question is, first we need to have a shift, right? We need to have a shift in terms of our approach to mental illness. Secondly, after that shift, we need to have more funding and, you know, create more instructional institutions to support them. CAMH and CMHA are doing most of the work. Elizabeth Fry and John Howard does some important work as well, but it's not enough. And mental illness, ladies and gentlemen, the numbers are not going to decrease. It's actually going to increase over time. I hope that answered your question.
First, I would like to say, you know, may Allah have mercy on your brother.
Ameen.
I sort of felt your pain, but your pain is obviously even more. I would like to ask you a question. Do you think only the guy should be accountable, or also the facility, the correction facility? Because if they're aware of the problems, what's happening since 2013, right? So how come they're not taking any action? Like, is that what they're training him to do, or what's going on there?
I think it's a very important question. No, everybody's complicit. Everybody's should be held accountable. From the prison ward, from, you know, the manager, they all need to be held accountable to a certain extent, right? This isn't just about the violent death of Suleiman. This is also a systematic failure. Ladies and gentlemen, Suleiman didn't just have a family, didn't just have, you know, oftentimes what happens, the tragedy with people that suffer from mental illness, there's a detachment between them and their family. Suleiman had a powerful rock in the form of my mother, you know, and then my other siblings who followed her leadership that was very proactive in helping, but that this system didn't even allow us. So the system is also complicit in this. It's very important. But there needs to be, you know, there needs to be that kind of change, and we need to really think about how that looks like, right? What's also important, ladies and gentlemen, a day after Suleiman was killed, the minister resigned on December 17th, 2016. So everybody's complicit, in my opinion, in one shape or another, just like all the other individuals that have lost their lives in mental health institutions, in jails, actually.
Can you just clarify the minister's resignation? Was there any explicit linking to your brother's death, or?
I don't know if there is any links to it, but it's important that, like, you know, the minister resigns a day after Suleiman, you know, and then It almost took about 2 years. The guards get fired, right? But why is it taking so long, right? So.
Okay. Any other?
Okay, so I know that that the people that beat your brother was like fired or suspended, but is there a reason that they weren't charged?
That's the million-dollar question. No, the Corte Lakes Police Service never gave my family a reason as to why. Never gave my lawyers actually as to why the guards were not charged, right? And what's also important, ladies and gentlemen, is that my family had to fight tooth and nail to get information in terms of, to get a hold of the police report. And at one point, after the investigation done, we tried to get the police report and they denied us through our Freedom of Information request. Freedom of Information request, for anybody who doesn't know that, is basically you apply to a certain institution to get certain information. We applied for that. They denied it. Only after we got involved, the Information Privacy Commission of Ontario, which is another organ of government, did the police give us partial access. So to this day, we have not been told as to why the guards weren't charged.
But still, it's technically abuse, right? So like they kind of, and like they still technically killed him too. So
it wasn't technical. They had a vicious beating to his death. 50 bruises coming from the corner. This is not even from us. Coming from the corner, that's a vicious beating.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's ridiculous that they weren't charged.
That's the question. That's why we should be appalled.
And that's what you're looking for?
They need to be criminally charged, Faisal. Yes, criminal charges.
Okay. So what I'm going to ask is that, did your view on mental health change after your brother's death? Or were you aware of like all these consequences and everything that was happening beforehand?
It's a very tough question, but I'll share with you. I was telling Professor Faisal that when Suleiman was diagnosed with this illness, for the first couple of years, it was very difficult for me to understand what this is. And I remember one time I made a mistake, and I called Suleiman, called him crazy, and he went upstairs to the room and he brought his medications. And this is the first time, ladies and gentlemen, I'm publicly sharing this with everybody. He comes up and he has tears. He said, Yusuf, you think I want this? You think this is my choice? He said, this took my life away from me. And I started crying and I felt the worst person in the world. And I told him, I love you, bro. Because that word right there, right? It's a derogatory word. I don't use that word anymore. Crazy, or out of your mind, right? These words, right, that we're not cognizant of. And so to relate it to your question is that I learned very quickly to not ever look at my brother from the lens of mental illness, but the lens of Suleiman Faqiri, the brother who's 18 months younger than me, who came from war-torn Afghanistan as a refugee, who was the brilliant brother, the one that raised my 9-year-old, my youngest brother when my mom was sick, or the brother that taught me how to pray. And that happened in a difficult way, but I cherish those moments, and I'm very thankful that I was able to cherish those moments when he was, throughout his illness. And after he passed away, after he was killed, I realized there's a lot that I didn't know about the justice system. I'm the type of person, I believe there can be a lot that can come out of our justice system. But the problem with our justice system, I feel like when it comes to mental illness, we fail miserably, right? And so now looking at it, when I give these stories, I feel an extra duty and responsibility that when someone's suffering with mental illness, I have to be able to help them when it comes to the justice system. And the justice system when it comes to mental illness has to change. It's like it's a revolving door. People with mental illness should not be treated the same way other individuals that are within the justice system, but unfortunately they are. And most of the time they're given in body bags. I hope that answered your question.
Yep, thank you.
There's one. Oh.
Thank you very much for speaking with us. I work with the LOST program here, which is a program which connects law to high schools. So actually those two wonderful questions were from grade 10 students in our program.
Our future is bright.
Our future lawyers.
Our future is bright.
I also really identify with your story. My older brother has schizophrenia, and I wanted to know what your opinion is when it comes to mobile crisis intervention teams. So before coming into this role, I worked at Rexdale Legal Clinic, and I often had clients with schizophrenia as well. And a lot of times their families would mention their concern with calling the police when something happens, because sometimes there is a fear for people around, but sometimes it's a fear within the family itself. And Toronto Police is supposed to have mental health crisis intervention teams to come to kind of speak to this need of having specialized people to support in issues of also a criminal matter. Just wanted to know what your opinion is on that, or if you think that's effective, or just any ideas and thoughts.
I think it's a good start. I mean, in Durham, they also have, and I think some regions also have ACT teams, right? They do some important work, and that's contingent on family support, and I think it's great. But I don't think it goes far enough. I mean, with mobile crisis, I mean, everybody knows the tragic story of Andrew Loku, and if you don't, please read his story. It was a man in his 40s, came here as a refugee from the south of Sudan, lost his life. Or the story of Mature Madad in Winnipeg. Both also, he just passed away this summer, also had mental illness. But and that had to do with sometimes with mobile crisis. But I think what's often needed more, in my opinion, in addition to these mobile crisis groups, you need the families sometimes to be more involved in the conversation. The families sometimes need to be able to, because sometimes some individuals suffer from mental illness, there's a cultural gap, right? Numbers with mental illness are higher among individuals that come from war-torn countries. That's not an opinion. That's actually a fact. If you come from the south of Sudan, Syria, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, the Congo, chances are the numbers will be higher. And so sometimes it go a long way to have a community, a community liaison. I think that's very important. And that can be the difference to de-escalate, because oftentimes what happens is there's this culture when it comes with certain, not all law enforcement, but some law enforcement, where it's this reactive. It shouldn't be reactive, it should be proactive, right? And this is very important. We got a long way to go, but I think mobile crisis is our best thing right now, but it's not good enough in my opinion. It's not good enough. I hope that answered your question.
I just wanted to say thank you again for coming, and condolences once again to your family. And I just want to know, as future law students, or future lawyers, how can we do our part in the criminal justice system in interacting with individuals suffering from mental health problems, or what do you think is the best recourse for that when interacting with them?
I think the first start off should be some mental health crisis training. I mean, right off the bat, that's the simplest part. If I was hazard to guess, and I've had conversations with certain individuals within certain faculties, in other law school departments, I don't know any law school that has that. And the fact that there's more than 50 of you here says a lot. That it's not just about an interest. There's this sincere engagement that we need to do this. I think we have the mental health training, and some faculty have done it, but there needs to be a more coordinated effort. In addition to the mental health training, there needs to be, I think, in my opinion, in the legal field, a better understanding of, the intersectionality of the criminal justice system and mental illness. Oftentimes, they operate in silos. And when they do intersect, it's in a very combative way. And that is up to the faculty, in my opinion, and you as future practitioners to reconcile those two parts, right? Because make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, some of you will become duty counsel. Are you going to go treat that client within the parameters of the law? Or what if you had someone who's suffering from mental illness and their story is similar to your loved one? Is it just about falling within the parameters of the law? And I'm not saying break parameters by the law. I'm saying, oh, this person's this, so they did this, we need to charge. But what if you make a recommendation, you know what, perhaps there should be a mental health assessment, right? Oftentimes, what happens when in the intersectionality of mental illness in the justice system, it's as if there's two fields and they got nothing to do with each other. But the first thing everyone, in my opinion, that's studying law in any field in this country, have a mental health training. Because guess what? Every single one of you will go through that intersection. Make no mistake about that.
Okay, well, looking at the time, I think I can take this moment to invite Cheyenne Malik up to offer some concluding remarks and to thank Yusuf for the presentation and for answering the questions. So I'll hand it over to you.
And if anybody needs me personally, like in terms of getting in contact with us, we have a list. And if anybody has any personal questions on mental health, I'm here for you. Believe me, privately, call me. I'm here for you. Okay?
We have the room until 2:30, and in fact, you feel free to stay longer. Yusuf will stick around. There's still some pizza, so don't feel like you need to rush.
Stay for the pizza.
Okay, I'll make this brief. I know we only have a few minutes left. First of all, I wanted to thank Yusuf for sharing personal stories and shedding light about who Solomon was and what he was like before his life was tragically and unjustly cut short. Also, I'd like to just give a special shout out to the Nathanson Center and Professor Faisal Baba and some of the student organizations that were involved, so the Mental Health Law Association and the Criminal Law Students Association, who made this possible and organized this event. Now, for the Muslim law students, I can say personally that they're honored to have been a part of supporting this event because this is an issue, as Yusuf sort of mentioned, that doesn't get a lot of attention in our community. They aren't as open to talking about it as much as they could or should. And honestly, it's an important issue that affects us all, and it's a conversation that should be taking place more often. Now, as Yusuf pointed out, whether it's through a loved one or some of the clients that we'll be serving, this is an issue that many of us can identify with, and it impacts us all. Now, on that note, I sort of just wanted to encourage you to stick around. There's still some pizza left, as Professor Baba mentioned. You can stick around for that, or you can stick around to ask some more questions. Yusuf's campaign manager is right there in the corner over there. Yeah, she's waving right now. So you can talk to her about some of the ways you can get involved or help out. So thank you for coming out today and joining us and being a part of this important conversation.